Picture this. You're walking through the bustling streets of medieval London at dusk, the smell of roasted meat and human waste filling your nostrils. Suddenly, a group of young men emerges from the shadows, armed with daggers and clubs, their eyes scanning for easy prey. But these aren't just common thieves. They're part of an organized criminal network that would make modern gang members look like choir boys. Welcome to the brutal reality of medieval gangs, where violence was a business, territory was everything, and law enforcement was often just another word for extortion. Think you know what urban crime looks like? Think again. The streets of medieval cities weren't just dangerous. They were war zones controlled by organized criminals who operated with a level of brutality and sophistication that would shock modern audiences. Before we dive into this medieval nightmare, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more dark truths that history books conveniently forgot to mention. The medieval city wasn't the romantic fairy tale setting you see in movies. It was a cesspool of humanity, where organized crime flourished like plague in a crowded tenement. These weren't just random acts of violence. We're talking about sophisticated criminal organizations that controlled entire neighborhoods, ran protection rackets, and turned murder into a profitable enterprise. The most terrifying part, many of these gangs operated with the tacit approval, or even direct involvement, of the very authorities meant to stop them. Let's start with the reality of medieval urban life that made these gangs possible. Cities in the Middle Ages were powder kegs waiting to explode. You had massive populations crammed into spaces that would make modern slums look spacious, with no real police force, no streetlights, and legal systems that were more interested in collecting fines than preventing crime. Into this chaos stepped organized criminals who saw opportunity where others saw only misery. Take London in the 14th century, for example. The city was home to numerous gangs with names that sound almost comical today, but struck genuine terror into the hearts of citizens. The Foleville Gang wasn't just a group of petty criminals. They were a criminal dynasty that operated for over 2 decades, engaging in everything from highway robbery to political assassination. Led by the Foleville brothers, this gang didn't just steal from travelers. They held entire regions hostage, demanding tribute from merchants and even local nobles who wanted safe passage through their territory. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. These weren't outcasts operating on society's fringes. Many gang members came from respectable families, including minor nobility who saw crime as just another way to supplement their income. The Folevilles themselves were from a family of minor landowners who decided that traditional feudal obligations were less profitable than organized crime. They operated with such impunity that they even held a sitting judge prisoner for ransom, forcing him to sign documents that effectively legalized their criminal activities in exchange for his freedom. The brutality of these medieval gangs makes modern organized crime look restrained by comparison. Violence wasn't just a tool. It was an art form designed to send messages that would echo through communities for generations. Gang members didn't just kill their enemies. They made spectacles of their deaths that served as warnings to anyone who might consider crossing them. Consider the case of the Cotterell Gang in 14th century England. When they wanted to eliminate a rival, they didn't simply assassinate him quietly. Instead, they would capture their target, torture him publicly in the town square, and then display his mutilated body as a warning to others. One documented case describes how they captured a merchant who had refused to pay their protection fee, broke every bone in his hands with hammers while the townspeople watched, and then hung his still-living body from the town's market cross, where he died slowly over several days. The psychological warfare employed by these gangs was perhaps even more effective than their physical violence. They understood that fear was a currency more valuable than gold, and they invested heavily in their reputations for absolute ruthlessness. Gang members would often mutilate themselves to appear more frightening, cutting off parts of their ears, scarring their faces deliberately, or even removing teeth to create more menacing smiles. The message was clear. If they were willing to do this to themselves, imagine what they'd do to their enemies. But let's have a reality check here. While these extreme examples of violence did occur, they weren't happening on every street corner every single day. Medieval cities were dangerous, yes, but people still managed to live, work, and raise families in them. The gangs were a serious problem, but they weren't omnipresent monsters lurking in every shadow. However, when they did strike, the impact was devastating precisely because law enforcement was so inadequate. Now, Here's where the story takes an even darker turn: the relationship between medieval gangs and the authorities. You might assume that law enforcement was simply overwhelmed by organized crime, but the reality is far more sinister. In many cases, the authorities weren't fighting the gangs, they were in business with them. Medieval law enforcement was largely a private enterprise. Sheriffs, constables, and other officials were often appointed positions that came with the expectation that the holder would profit from their role. This created a system where those meant to uphold the law had every incentive to look the other way when it came to organized crime, provided they received their cut of the profits. The Ashby Gang of 14th century Leicestershire provides a perfect example of this corruption. Led by a man named James Ashby, this criminal organization operated for over 15 years with the full knowledge and cooperation of local law enforcement. Ashby didn't just bribe officials, he actually employed several constables and even a deputy sheriff as full-time gang members. When merchants complained about being robbed, these same officials would take their statements, promise to investigate, and then report back to Ashby with the names of anyone who might testify against the gang. The corruption ran so deep that when King Edward III finally sent royal investigators to look into the situation, they discovered that the local court system had been completely compromised. Court records had been deliberately falsified, witnesses had been intimidated or eliminated, and several judges were receiving regular payments from the Ashby Gang in exchange for lenient sentences or outright dismissals of charges. The investigators found evidence that in one particularly brazen case, Ashby had actually sat in on a court session where he was supposed to be tried for robbery, helped the judge decide his own sentence, and then walked free after paying a nominal fine. But the relationship between gangs and authority figures went beyond simple corruption. In some cases, legitimate political figures used gangs as unofficial enforcers of their will. Noble families would hire entire criminal organizations to intimidate their rivals, collect debts, or even carry out political assassinations that they couldn't be directly linked to. The Brabant Gang, that terrorized parts of what is now Belgium and the Netherlands in the late 14th and early 15th centuries, operated with direct support from competing noble factions. When Duke Philip the Bold wanted to eliminate political rivals without the messy complications of formal declarations of war, he would simply provide the Brabant Gang with information about their movements, supply them with weapons, and then publicly condemn their actions while privately rewarding their success. This gang didn't just rob travelers, they engaged in what we would now recognize as terrorism, designed to destabilize entire regions. They would attack trade caravans, not just for their goods, but to disrupt commerce between rival cities. They burned churches and monasteries, not for religious reasons, but because these institutions often served as banks and record-keeping centers for their political enemies. They kidnapped the children of wealthy merchants and minor nobles, holding them for ransom while simultaneously gathering intelligence about family connections and business relationships that could be exploited later. The most chilling aspect of their operations was their recruitment strategy. Rather than simply accepting volunteers, the Brabant Gang actively sought out individuals with specific skills and connections. They recruited former soldiers who knew military tactics, clerks who could forge documents, and even priests who could provide them with sanctuary in religious buildings. They created what was essentially a criminal corporation with specialized departments for different types of illegal activity. Let me give you a reality check about the scale of these operations. While individual gangs like the Brabant Gang could indeed terrorize entire regions, they were relatively rare. Most medieval criminal organizations were much smaller and more localized in their operations. However, the few large-scale gangs that did emerge left such a mark on historical records precisely because they were so unusually destructive and well-organized. The recruitment methods employed by medieval gangs reveal another disturbing aspect of their operations. They were often more appealing to young men than legitimate employment. In a world where social mobility was virtually non-existent and most people were locked into the same economic class they were born into, joining a criminal organization offered one of the few paths to wealth and status advancement available to common people. Medieval gangs operated sophisticated recruitment networks that specifically targeted vulnerable populations. They would send recruiters to rural areas during times of famine or economic hardship, offering young men immediate payment, regular meals, and the promise of wealth beyond their wildest dreams. These recruiters weren't just random gang members, they were skilled manipulators who understood exactly what psychological buttons to push. Consider the recruitment tactics used by the Essex Wolves, a gang that operated in eastern England during the 15th century. Their recruiters would arrive in small farming communities during harvest season, just when young men were most acutely aware of how little their back-breaking labor would earn them for an entire year. They would flash expensive jewelry, wear fine clothes, and regale local taverns with stories of the easy money to be made in their organization. But here's the truly sinister part. They didn't just recruit individuals. The Essex Wolves actively worked to destroy the social fabric of communities to make their recruitment more effective. They would identify local leaders, village elders, successful merchants, respected craftsmen, and systematically eliminate or discredit them. This created a power vacuum that made their criminal organization appear to be the only source of stability and protection available to desperate people. Once recruited, new gang members underwent what can only be described as criminal boot camp. They were taught not just how to fight and steal, but how to blend into different social situations, how to gather intelligence, and how to exploit the weaknesses of various segments of society. The Essex Wolves, for example, trained their members to pose as merchants, pilgrims, or even minor clergy to gain access to potential targets. The initiation rituals for these gangs were designed to ensure absolute loyalty through a combination of psychological manipulation and genuine terror. New recruits weren't just asked to swear oaths of loyalty. They were required to participate in crimes so heinous that they would be permanently marked as criminals in the eyes of society, making return to normal life virtually impossible. One documented initiation ritual from the Blackwater gang of medieval Ireland required new members to murder a randomly selected innocent person within their first week of membership. But they couldn't just commit the murder. They had to do it in a specific way that demonstrated their commitment to the gang's methods. The victim had to be someone the recruit had never met before. The killing had to be carried out with a weapon provided by the gang, and the recruit had to bring back a specific body part as proof of their deed. This wasn't just about proving willingness to kill, it was about psychological transformation. By forcing recruits to commit seemingly random acts of extreme violence, the gang was breaking down their normal moral inhibitions and replacing them with absolute loyalty to the criminal organization. Former members who were eventually captured and interrogated described feeling like they had become different people entirely, incapable of imagining life outside the gang structure. The daily operations of these medieval criminal organizations reveal a level of sophistication that challenges our assumptions about the capabilities of people living in what we often think of as primitive times. These weren't just bands of thugs engaging in random violence. They were complex business enterprises with detailed operational procedures, sophisticated intelligence networks, and carefully planned long-term strategies. Take the Flemish Brotherhood, a criminal organization that operated across multiple countries in northwestern Europe during the 14th century. They maintained detailed written records of their operations, including maps of target locations, profiles of potential victims, and even financial statements that tracked income and expenses for different types of criminal activity. When authorities finally raided one of their safe houses, they discovered documents that revealed an organization more complex than many legitimate businesses of the time. The Brotherhood operated what was essentially a criminal franchise system. Local gang leaders would pay a percentage of their profits to the central organization in exchange for access to intelligence networks, specialized equipment, and protection from rival gangs. They had established safe houses in major cities across Europe, maintained a communication system that allowed them to coordinate operations across vast distances, and even operated their own informal banking system to help members transfer stolen wealth without detection. But perhaps most impressive was their intelligence operation. The Flemish Brotherhood maintained networks of informants in every major city within their territory. These informants weren't just criminals. They were legitimate business people, government officials, and even religious figures who provided information in exchange for protection or profit sharing. They knew the travel schedules of wealthy merchants months in advance, had detailed information about the security arrangements of major trade routes, and could even predict when law enforcement crackdowns were likely to occur. The Brotherhood's approach to violence was equally sophisticated. Rather than relying on random brutality, They employed what we would now recognize as psychological warfare tactics designed to maximize fear while minimizing the risk of provoking massive retaliation from authorities. They would carefully select victims whose deaths or disappearances would send specific messages to their intended audiences, and they would time their attacks to coincide with major public events to ensure maximum visibility. One particularly calculated attack involved the simultaneous assassination of 3 prominent merchants in different cities on the same day, the feast day of St. Thomas Aquinas, when most people would be attending religious services. The timing wasn't random. By choosing a major religious holiday, the Brotherhood ensured that their message would be discussed in churches, taverns, and marketplaces across the region for weeks afterward. The psychological impact was far greater than the simple elimination of 3 individuals. Now let's reality check this again. While the Flemish Brotherhood was indeed a remarkably sophisticated criminal organization, they were exceptional rather than typical. Most medieval gangs were much more localized and less organized. However, the existence of such complex criminal enterprises demonstrates that medieval society was capable of producing organizational structures that rival modern criminal organizations in their sophistication and reach. The economic impact of medieval gangs on their communities was devastating in ways that go far beyond simple theft and extortion. These criminal organizations didn't just take money from their victims, they systematically undermined the economic foundation of entire regions by making normal commercial activity virtually impossible. Consider the impact of the Yorkshire Rovers on trade in northern England during the 15th century. This gang didn't just rob individual merchants, they made traveling for commercial purposes so dangerous that many trade routes were completely abandoned. Small towns that had thrived as stopping points for merchant caravans found themselves economically isolated when traders began taking longer, more expensive routes to avoid gang territory. The economic ripple effects were catastrophic. When merchants stopped traveling through certain areas, the inns, stables, and markets that depended on their business began to fail. Craftsmen who had sold their goods to traveling traders found themselves without customers. Farmers who had grown crops specifically for sale to merchant caravans were left with surplus produce that rotted because there was no longer a market for it. But the gangs didn't stop at disrupting existing trade. They actively worked to eliminate competition for their criminal enterprises. The Yorkshire Rovers, for example, would identify the most successful legitimate businesses in their territory and systematically destroy them through a combination of extortion, sabotage, and intimidation. They understood that desperate people were more likely to join their organization or cooperate with their demands, so they actively created the desperation they needed to maintain their power. The gang would begin by demanding protection money from successful businesses. If the business owners paid, the gang would gradually increase their demands until the business was no longer profitable. If the owners refused to pay, the gang would escalate to property destruction, employee intimidation, and eventually violence against the business owners themselves. Either way, the legitimate business would eventually fail, creating economic opportunities that the gang could exploit. This systematic destruction of legitimate economic activity created what economists would now recognize as a poverty trap. As legal ways of making money disappeared, more people were forced to choose between starvation and joining criminal organizations. The gangs understood this dynamic perfectly and exploited it ruthlessly to maintain a steady supply of desperate recruits willing to do anything for survival. The territorial control exercised by medieval gangs was often more absolute than that of legitimate government authorities. While kings and nobles might theoretically own vast territories, their actual ability to control what happened in remote areas was often minimal. Criminal organizations, by contrast, maintained constant presence in their territories and enforced their will through immediate, brutal consequences for disobedience. The border rivers who operated along the English-Scottish border during the late medieval period provide an excellent example of this territorial control. These weren't just raiders who would strike and disappear. They were the de facto government of entire regions where official authority had completely broken down. They collected taxes more efficiently than legitimate tax collectors, settled disputes more quickly than official courts, and provided protection services that were more reliable than those offered by legal authorities. But their version of governance was a nightmare that makes the worst authoritarian regimes in history look benevolent by comparison. The border reivers didn't just demand obedience, they demanded absolute submission to their arbitrary will. Families living in their territory were required to provide young men for gang service, food for gang members, and information about the activities of anyone who might pose a threat to gang interests. Resistance wasn't just punished, it was eliminated with a thoroughness that served as a warning to others. When the Crawford family attempted to organize resistance to reiver demands in their village, the gang's response was swift and horrific. They didn't just kill the family members involved in the resistance, they eliminated every person who shared the Crawford name within a 50-mile radius, burned every building they had ever owned, killed their livestock, and salted their fields to ensure nothing would grow there for years to come. The message was clear: resistance wouldn't just result in your death, but in the complete erasure of your family line and everything you had ever built. This level of systematic destruction created a climate of terror so complete that most people living in gang territory never even considered the possibility of resistance. Yet, here's a crucial reality check. While the border reivers were indeed brutal and controlled significant territory, they operated in a region where central government authority had largely collapsed due to ongoing warfare between England and Scotland. In areas with stronger central authority, gangs generally couldn't achieve this level of territorial control. The border reivers were products of specific historical circumstances that made their extreme dominance possible. The relationship between medieval gangs and religion reveals another disturbing aspect of their operations. Rather than existing in opposition to religious authority, many criminal organizations actively exploited religious institutions and beliefs to further their criminal enterprises. Churches and monasteries weren't just potential targets for robbery, they were strategic assets that could be exploited in numerous ways. Religious buildings often served as informal banks where people stored valuables. They were centers of communication where information could be gathered, and they provided sanctuary that could protect gang members from immediate retaliation. The sanctuary gang that operated in medieval France took this exploitation to its logical extreme. Rather than simply using churches for occasional shelter, they systematically infiltrated religious institutions by placing gang members in positions as monks, priests, and even abbots. These religious criminals used their positions to gather intelligence about the wealth and movements of prominent church members, identify valuable items that could be stolen, and provide safe houses for other gang members. But their exploitation of religion went far beyond simple infiltration. The sanctuary gang actively perverted religious practices to serve their criminal purposes. They would organize false pilgrimages that were actually reconnaissance missions to identify potential targets in distant cities. They would perform fake religious ceremonies to gain access to private homes and businesses. They even established their own fake monastery that served as a headquarters for their operations while maintaining the appearance of legitimate religious activity. Perhaps most disturbing was their exploitation of the medieval belief in divine justice. The gang would often frame their crimes as religious punishment for various sins, convincing their victims that resistance would be tantamount to defying God's will. They would study religious texts to identify passages that could be interpreted as justifying their actions, and they would quote scripture while torturing their victims to make their suffering seem like divine retribution rather than simple criminal violence. One documented case describes how they convinced an entire village that a series of murders they had committed were actually divine punishment for the community's failure to properly observe religious holidays. The gang members, posing as wandering monks, gave sermons explaining how God was testing the village's faith through these deaths and how attempting to seek justice through secular authorities would only bring more divine wrath upon the community. This psychological manipulation was so effective that when legitimate church authorities arrived to investigate the murders, the villagers actually protected the gang members, believing that turning them over to secular justice would result in supernatural punishment for their entire community. The international scope of some medieval criminal organizations challenges our assumptions about the limitations of communication and travel in the Middle Ages. While we often think of medieval Europe as a collection of isolated communities with limited contact with the outside world, the reality is that criminal networks often operated across vast distances with remarkable efficiency. The Silk Road Syndicate operated along trade routes connecting Europe, Asia, and North Africa during the height of medieval commerce. This wasn't just a single gang, but a confederation of criminal organizations that coordinated their activities across multiple continents. They maintained communication networks that allowed them to track valuable shipments from their points of origin to their final destinations, coordinate attacks across thousands of miles, and share intelligence about law enforcement activities in different regions. Their operations were so sophisticated that they essentially created a parallel economy based entirely on stolen goods. When they robbed a silk caravan in Central Asia, they already had buyers lined up in European cities who would purchase the stolen merchandise and distribute it through networks of corrupt merchants. The stolen goods would be mixed with legitimate merchandise, transported along established trade routes, and sold in markets hundreds or even thousands of miles from where they were originally stolen. The syndicate maintained detailed records of their operations that reveal an organization more complex than many legitimate international trading companies of the time. They tracked profit margins for different types of theft, maintained databases of corrupt officials in different cities who could be bribed to look the other way, and even operated their own informal insurance system to compensate gang members who were captured or killed during operations. But perhaps most impressive was their intelligence network. The Silk Road Syndicate knew about valuable shipments weeks or even months before they began their journeys. They had informants in merchant guilds, government offices, and even royal courts, who provided advance warning about trade missions, diplomatic expeditions, and military movements that might interfere with their operations. This intelligence network was so effective that they could often predict and prepare for law enforcement crackdowns before the authorities had even finalized their plans. When King Louis IX of France organized a major campaign to eliminate criminal activity along French trade routes, the syndicate knew about it months in advance and had already relocated their operations to avoid the areas where royal forces would be concentrated. The technological innovations developed by medieval gangs for their criminal purposes often exceeded anything available to legitimate authorities at the time. Necessity, as they say, is the mother of invention, and medieval criminals were extremely inventive when it came to developing new methods for theft, violence, and evading capture. The Iron Brotherhood of medieval Germany developed what may have been the first systematic use of what we would now recognize as industrial espionage. They didn't just steal finished goods. They stole the knowledge and techniques used to create valuable products, then established their own illegal manufacturing operations to produce counterfeit versions. Their most sophisticated operation involved the theft of closely guarded glassmaking techniques from Venetian craftsmen. Rather than simply robbing glass merchants, the Iron Brotherhood spent months infiltrating the Venetian glass industry, placing gang members as apprentices in legitimate workshops where they could learn the secret techniques that made Venetian glass so valuable. Once they had acquired the necessary knowledge, they established their own glass-making operation in a remote location, kidnapped several skilled Venetian craftsmen to serve as forced labor, and began producing high-quality, counterfeit Venetian glass that they sold throughout Europe, at prices significantly below those of legitimate merchants. But their innovation didn't stop at manufacturing. The Iron Brotherhood developed sophisticated techniques for aging their counterfeit products to make them appear to be valuable antiques, created fake documentation to establish false provenance for stolen artworks, and even developed their own encryption methods to protect their communications from interception by authorities. Their encryption system was based on a complex combination of religious symbolism and mathematical codes that wouldn't be deciphered by historians until the 20th century. When law enforcement officials intercepted their communications, they appeared to be religious texts or business correspondence that revealed nothing about criminal activities. Only gang members who had been trained in the specific decryption methods could extract the actual operational information hidden within seemingly innocent documents. The Iron Brotherhood also pioneered the use of what we would now recognize as psychological profiling to select their victims and plan their crimes. They maintained detailed records of the personality traits, habits, and vulnerabilities of potential targets, and they developed specific approaches for exploiting different types of people. For example, they identified that deeply religious individuals could be manipulated through appeals to their faith, that wealthy merchants were often susceptible to get-rich-quick schemes, and that minor nobles were frequently desperate to maintain appearances despite financial difficulties. They developed specialized con games designed to exploit each of these psychological vulnerabilities, often spending months setting up elaborate scenarios that would allow them to steal far more than they could have taken through simple robbery. Let me provide another reality check here. While the Iron Brotherhood was indeed remarkably innovative, most medieval gangs operated with much simpler methods and technology. The sophisticated techniques I'm describing were exceptional rather than typical. However, the existence of such advanced criminal operations demonstrates that medieval society was capable of producing individuals with remarkable technical and organizational skills, even when those skills were applied to illegal purposes. The law enforcement response to medieval gangs reveals the limitations and corruption of justice systems during this period. While we often think of medieval law as being harsh and unforgiving, the reality is that it was often ineffective against organized crime, not because the punishments weren't severe enough, but because the entire system was riddled with corruption and structural weaknesses that criminal organizations could easily exploit. The case of the London cutthroats illustrates the fundamental problems with medieval law enforcement. This gang operated in the heart of England's capital city for over 2 decades, despite being responsible for hundreds of documented murders, robberies, and kidnappings. They weren't successful because they were particularly skilled at avoiding detection. They were successful because they had systematically corrupted every level of the law enforcement system that was supposed to stop them. The cutthroats began their corruption campaign by identifying the lowest-level law enforcement officials, night watchmen, constables, and court clerks, and either bribing them or intimidating them into cooperation. Once they had compromised these individuals, they used their positions to gather intelligence about planned law enforcement activities and to ensure that evidence against gang members would mysteriously disappear before trials could begin. But they didn't stop at low-level corruption. The cutthroats understood that lasting protection required corrupting officials at the highest levels of the justice system. They used a combination of bribery, blackmail, and strategic violence to compromise judges, sheriffs, and even members of parliament who had influence over law enforcement policy. One particularly brazen example of their corruption involved a judge named Sir William de Ashby, who was supposed to preside over the trial of several gang members accused of murdering a prominent merchant. Rather than simply bribing the judge, the cutthroats discovered that he had been embezzling funds from his court for years to pay gambling debts. They used this information to blackmail him into not just dismissing the charges, but actually helping them frame several innocent people for the crimes their members had committed. The corruption became so extensive that when King Edward II finally ordered a royal investigation into organized crime in London, the investigators discovered that virtually every law enforcement official in the city was either directly employed by criminal organizations or so thoroughly compromised that they were incapable of taking effective action against them. The royal investigators found evidence that some judges were actually receiving larger incomes from criminal organizations than they were from their official salaries. Court clerks were routinely altering official records to eliminate evidence of gang activities. Even the Sheriff of London, the highest law enforcement official in the city, was found to be providing the cutthroats with advance warning of planned raids and arrests. When authorities attempted to clean up the corruption, they discovered that it had become so systematic that removing all the compromised officials would have left the city with virtually no law enforcement capability at all. The criminal organizations had essentially replaced the legitimate justice system with their own parallel structure that served their interests while maintaining the appearance of legal authority. The international cooperation between medieval criminal organizations reveals another aspect of their sophistication that challenges our assumptions about the limitations of medieval communication and coordination. These weren't just local gangs that occasionally cooperated, they were parts of international criminal networks that coordinated their activities across vast distances with remarkable efficiency. The Northern Alliance was a confederation of criminal organizations that operated across Scandinavia, Northern England, and Eastern Scotland during the 14th and 15th centuries. Despite the geographical challenges of coordinating activities across such a vast and difficult terrain, they maintained communication systems that allowed them to share intelligence, coordinate major operations, and even transfer personnel between different regional gangs as circumstances required. Their communication system was based on a network of seemingly legitimate merchants, pilgrims, and religious figures who carried coded messages between different gang territories. These messengers weren't just random collaborators. They were specially trained individuals who memorized complex codes that allowed them to transmit detailed operational information without creating any written records that could be intercepted by authorities. The Alliance coordinated their activities so effectively that they could simultaneously disrupt trade routes across multiple countries, making it virtually impossible for merchants to simply avoid dangerous areas by changing their routes. When authorities in one region began to crack down on criminal activity, gang members could quickly relocate to territories controlled by allied organizations, making it nearly impossible for law enforcement to maintain pressure on the criminal networks. But perhaps most impressive was their ability to coordinate major operations that required simultaneous action across multiple countries. One documented example describes how the Alliance organized the simultaneous kidnapping of prominent merchants in 5 different cities across 3 countries, with each kidnapping timed to occur during major religious festivals when local authorities would be distracted by ceremonial duties. The kidnappings weren't random crimes. They were part of a coordinated strategy to disrupt a major international trade agreement that would have reduced the opportunities for criminal activity along certain routes. By kidnapping key negotiators at precisely the right moment, the Alliance was able to prevent the agreement from being finalized, preserving their criminal opportunities while making it appear that the disruption was due to random criminal activity rather than organized interference. The Alliance even operated what was essentially an international criminal court system that settled disputes between different gang organizations and coordinated responses to law enforcement activities. When conflicts arose between member organizations, rather than allowing them to escalate into destructive gang wars, the Alliance leadership would convene formal hearings where evidence would be presented and binding decisions would be made about how to resolve the disputes. This criminal justice system was often more efficient and fair than the legitimate court systems of the time. Disputes that might have taken months or years to resolve through official legal channels could be settled by the Alliance court system in a matter of days, with decisions that were enforced more reliably than many official court judgments. So there you have it, the brutal reality of medieval gangs exposed. These weren't just bands of desperate criminals engaging in random violence. They were sophisticated criminal organizations that operated with levels of planning, coordination, and ruthlessness that would make modern organized crime figures take notes. They corrupted entire justice systems, controlled vast territories, and operated international networks that coordinated criminal activities across multiple countries with remarkable efficiency. The dark truth is that medieval cities weren't just dangerous because of random crime. They were war zones controlled by criminal organizations that had essentially replaced legitimate authority with their own brutal version of law and order. These gangs didn't just steal from their victims. They systematically destroyed the economic and social fabric of entire communities, turning prosperity into poverty and hope into despair wherever they operated. But here's the most chilling part. Many of these criminal organizations were more efficient, better organized, and more effective than the legitimate governments that were supposed to stop them. They provided services that official authorities couldn't or wouldn't provide. They maintained order in areas where legal authority had collapsed, and they operated with a level of international coordination that wouldn't be matched by legitimate law enforcement for centuries to come. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to go appreciate the fact that modern law enforcement, for all its flaws, doesn't require me to pay protection money to 3 different criminal organizations just to walk to the grocery store. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into the dark underbelly of medieval urban life, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell, because trust me, the rabbit hole of historical horrors goes much, much deeper than most people realize.